So all that is outrageous. I'd like to focus my time a little bit on what happened on the 11th and the 12th of November. You say in your testimony, I'm going to cite both your testimony and the declaration of the filing yesterday in court, that you accepted the position of Chief Executive Officer for FTX Group in the early morning hours of November the 11th and quickly realized bankruptcy filing was necessary, which began that day. You also say that as the cases were filed, debtors and their representatives worked tirelessly through the night to secure assets. You then go on in this yesterday's pleading, trying to block what the other liquidator was trying to do, to say that during this period, on the 11th and the 12th, as best I can build this, information emerged that debtor systems and assets were accessed from at least two sources. What are those two sources?
There was two situations going on. One is there was a hacking by a third party. We are tracing that hacking, using our own cyber teams, plus we're being assisted by the government in tracking the ultimate location of those crypto assets. And the other thing that happened at the same time was that, aided with resources of our former management, the Bahamian government took control of certain crypto assets.
Bahamian Commission.
Yes.
Instructed Misters Bankman-Fried and Wang to mint. What does that mean, to mint? A substantial number of new tokens and transfer hundreds of millions of dollars worth of these new tokens to cold storage for their benefit.
So what that refers to is that it's mentioning the FTT, which is a coin created by the company that could literally be minted. You could create new money with it. And so in that process, FTT was transferred to the Bahamian authorities.
To the tune of how much money?
Approximately
I read here
less than, about 300 million.
300 million. And you said that would be Mr. Bankman-Fried and Mr. Wang who did that minting and transferring.
And it's, I know we have information that they were both involved, whether Mr. Wang did it or Mr. Fried, obviously they were cooperating with the government in doing so.
And this is post-bankruptcy filings?
Post-bankruptcy, when the automatic stay was in effect.
That kind of wrongdoing, for somebody of your expertise, how is it that the walls were not secure? That someone was able, in this case one unknown and the other known, likely known, was able to go in, mint, manufacture tokens, and transfer them to a foreign government?
It really goes back to the control of the company and its assets in the hands of a few people, in this case wrongdoers. They held the keys and they knew where the wallets were. And there's just a lack of documentation, internal controls of separateness between the company's assets, who held the keys, and they were able to take those assets purely by the way the company was established. And
post the 11th or 12th, has that kind of access to the keys, minting, transferring, stopped?
We haven't seen any evidence of hacking. We've certainly have isolated any involvement of the former founders from the company, whether that's cash or other assets. What we don't know, right, is whether or not the founders could have taken crypto and put it in a cold wallet that we just don't have an awareness of. And if they did, hopefully we can trace that. We may find in the billions of data that we have a trail there, but it's possible that assets would have escaped the system and maybe exist in a thumb drive that we just don't have knowledge or possession of.
I thank you, Mr. Ray, and thank you for your team's work.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from New York, the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming here to testify today, Mr. Ray. I have a lot to get through, so we're going to try to get these answers as quickly as possible. I want to put together a little bit of a timeline of this collapse between November 12th and yesterday. On November 2nd, we have CoinDesk leaking these balance sheets. On the 8th, Binance signs a non-binding letter to acquire FTX, and Bankman-Fried freezes or pauses withdrawals from FTX. I would like to submit to the record your declaration to the U.S. Bankruptcy Court, or FTX's declaration to the U.S. Bankruptcy Court that was filed yesterday. Now, on November 9th, the day after those assets were frozen, Binance announced it would not go through with the purchase, and according to this filing, the same day, Bankman-Fried emailed the Bahamian Attorney General with an offer. That offer stated that he would offer to unfreeze withdrawals just for Bahamian customers on FTX, quote, so they can tomorrow fully withdraw all their assets. Correct? Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, on November 10th, FTX DM, the next day, was placed into a foreign provisional liquidation in the Bahamas, correct?
Correct.
The next morning. Now, after that, Bankman-Fried then made good on his offer, on his previous day's offer, in that email to the Bahamian AG, opening withdrawals just in the Bahamas for a period of 25.5 hours. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, during that period, $100 million was withdrawn in the Bahamas from FTX by 1,500 individuals, correct?
Correct.
And this was the day before you were set to take over. So he was still in control. This was like right before he was supposed to hand this off. Now, I think what we have here is that, or rather afterwards, on November 12th, we have what Congresswoman Dean was just asking about with this additional minting, these questions around this additional minting. And then on November 16th, the Bahamian appointed joint provisional liquidators did something very interesting. They came here to the United States Bankruptcy Court and sought an entry to recognize the Bahamian liquidation as the main foreign proceeding. Would that additional control be of any potential value to Mr. Bankman-Fried for that Bahamian proceeding to be the main one?
Well, clearly, there seemed to be an effort by the Bahamian Commission to get control of the bankruptcy process, and I think that was evident by their filing, which, by the way, was made up in New York, not Delaware.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that correction. Now, did you uncover any evidence that demonstrates that this window, that 25.5-hour window, opened in exchange for any consideration offered to Mr. Bankman-Fried by the Bahamian Attorney General or any state official, including a promise to initiate liquidation proceedings which might offer a path towards Mr. Bankman-Fried retaining some control or influence over FTX.com?
We intend to investigate that very thing.
Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to dig into a little bit of the timeline of yesterday. Yesterday, you filed that same declaration that revealed some of this explosive information. What time did you file this?
That was late.
Around what time?
Yeah, 3 or 4 o'clock.
Around 3 or 4 o'clock. Now, when you file this information, that essentially discloses that you are sharing this information, and it discloses that to opposing counsel, correct?
Yes, we docket it, and the world knows about it.
Now, if opposing counsel essentially becomes notified of this, that would mean that Bankman-Fried and potentially Bahamian officials would have been potentially privy to that information starting around 3 or 4 p.m., correct?
Correct.
What time was Mr. Bankman-Fried arrested yesterday?
I believe it was in the early evening hours, after 4 o'clock.
I believe it was
7 o'clock, perhaps.
It was in the evening, after that filing.
6, 7 o'clock, yes.
I would like to submit to the record the statement from the Attorney General of the Bahamas issued yesterday on the arrest of Mr. Samuel Bankman-Fried. And after submitting that to the record, I would like to note that in this statement, they stated at such time as a formal request for extradition is made, presumably by the Southern District of New York, but they do not state when that request for extradition was made. Do you believe that information is important for us to understand in order to piece together a timeline, Mr. Ray?
Yes, sir. I certainly don't have that full timeline, and that's something that we look forward to learning.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, who is also the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Ray, and thank you for your patience today as we come towards the end of this hearing. Let me just say that I was one city controller of Houston, and under me was the city auditor, so I've done a lot of audits, overseen a lot of audits, and this has got to be one of the most ridiculous, loosely-goosey operation I've ever seen. I wouldn't be surprised if you come back and tell us you found money under somebody's mattress, because it seems like there was a total lack of controls, total lack of transparency, total lack of any accountability. And it's much like an onion that every time you peel a layer, it gets a little smellier and uglier. So I know we need to stay tuned. I wanted to also go over a little quick timeline, following up on my colleagues' questions. And FTX International was founded before FTX US, correct?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
FTX International was put together before FTX US.
Yes.
So before FTX US, US customers didn't have a forum or a platform to participate in, because, as I understand it, FTX International was for non-USA customers.
That's correct.
So do you happen to know how many FTX US customers there really is?
We don't have an accurate customer count. We do have a user number, which is about 2.7 million. But customers did have multiple accounts, and some of those accounts have zero balances.
So
we need to get to the bottom of
2.7
it.
million.
Right.
We were told that I saw some information that said that it was about, I think it was 2% of the total picture of FTX customers. Is that about it?
Yeah, I don't know how they're calculating that. I mean, on a relative basis, though, the U.S. number of U.S. users and the value at the petition date, is relatively small compared to .com.
Well, I've been curious to find out, and I've asked this question of the White House Working Group and another number of people that have appeared before us just about this whole crypto space. Who is the consumer here? Who are the people being harmed? I'm not talking about hedge fund managers. I'm not talking about investors. I'm not talking about entities. How many real people are being hurt?
Well, we haven't, we don't have a breakdown by, say, institution versus individual. Clearly, there's a lot of individuals harmed by this, a lot of individual accounts. Crypto accounts are certainly something that, it's available to consumers. So I would expect the population would include a large amount of consumers.
So when you say that, are you telling me you have no consumer data, you just have account numbers right now?
We have account numbers. We can ultimately, figure out the names associated with those accounts. What we don't know, of course, necessarily is, what the identity necessarily is behind some of those account names.
So you don't have any information on their demographics or states? You can't tell me if I have any from my district?
Yeah, not at my fingertips.
You can't tell Mr. Auchincloss if there's any from his district?
Not at my fingertips. We certainly can accumulate that and break that down.
Well, I would be really interested, because obviously for many of us, it is our constituents that we want to make whole. While we have a concern for the entire crypto space and all of the people who participated in any of these trades on their platforms, we have a deeper concern, if you will, for our own constituents. And we need to make sure that we do make them whole. And I know in response to a previous question, you said you weren't sure when you'd be able to make everyone whole. Is that answer the same for the people for just the U.S., or is that also the same for the people in the FTX International?
It's same for all, for all the customers. I mean, obviously the extent of the harm appears greater on the international side. So, we're hopeful, again, on the U.S. side that the dissipated assets are not significant, and that obviously would lead to a greater recovery and a sooner recovery. But it's a little bit premature to really nail that down today.
Well, thank you. And I when you do the demographics and the consumer data, keep in mind that Morning Consult study showed that about a quarter of Black and Latino respondents own cryptocurrencies. It's a quarter compared to 17% of white respondents. We need to make sure that when we talk about making everybody whole, we're talking about everybody.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Ray. Let's go back to Enron. That trial was from January 30th, 2006 until May 25th, 2006. Pretty lengthy trial. I imagine that the federal prosecutors presented ample evidence. They were all kind of witnesses. Would it have been helpful to have the defendant testify before Congress for like 6 hours and answer a whole bunch of questions under oath prior to that trial? Would that have been helpful to federal prosecutors?
Well, by that time, the company had been confirmed out of bankruptcy. We had
before he was arrested. Would it have been helpful for him to come before Congress and testify for hours on end and answer every question that we could come up with?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
So it would have been really helpful.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Okay. So why 36 hours before he was scheduled to testify before this committee for hours on end did the Southern District of New York send a provisional arrest warrant to the Bohemian government to facilitate his arrest, to preclude his testimony, which would have been incredibly helpful in the prosecution of Sam Bankman-Fried?
I mean, I obviously can't speak for the agency.
It's kind of bizarre. I mean, I was a prosecutor for a number of years. I prosecuted complex white-collar cases. The thought of getting 6 hours of congressional grilling for a target of investigation or a defendant, that would be great for my case. So I just don't understand. I guess the grand jury returned the indictment on the 9th. Technically, you can delay weeks if you want to. So this was a decision made by somebody at DOJ to prevent Sam Bankman-Fried from coming here in a couple hours and testifying before Congress, answering questions in front of the American people. I've read his alleged testimony that he was gonna give. He's basically saying that he lacks the criminal intent. He lacks mens rea. He's saying that his attorneys pressured him into filing Chapter 11, that he immediately, after doing a DocuSign to sign away everything, said, I don't want to do that, told his attorneys, again, this is all what he says, told his attorneys that undo it, I do not want to do that. And it seems that he's been taking steps ever since that to try to wrangle control of his companies back. Is that fair to say?
You know, I can only read what you read in the press. I haven't talked to Mr. Fried.
So my friend from Wisconsin was talking about Chapter 15 versus Chapter 11. And that's basically the Bohemian government or outside, what do they call it? Joint provisional liquidators are trying to wrangle control of this bankruptcy. Is that fair to say?
It seems that way, yes.
And arguably, you're going to be going after the $100 million that was allowed by 1,500 Bohemian citizens to take out that was allegedly owed. You're still going to get to the bottom of that. So you plan on going after that money, correct?
We'll investigate every potential cause of action.
And if 1,500 people in the Bahamas were allowed 25 and a half hours to withdraw $100 million, do you plan on trying to get that back and distribute it appropriately?
We will certainly pursue every course of action to recover.
Okay. So where do you go from here? You're obviously going to do everything you can to maintain control of it and keep it in Chapter 11. Is that fair to say?
It is fair to say. I mean, we think the bankruptcy process here is the one place that has transparency and has the greatest ability to maximize value for creditors. But these things aren't usually mutually exclusive. We work with liquidators all the time on a cooperative basis. So this is a little bit unprecedented.
I think that's fair to say this is going to be a law school exam for many students in years to come. I'll end with this. I really look forward to figuring out why the Department of Justice issued the provisional arrest warrant to preclude Sam Bankman-Fried from testifying before us this afternoon. I do not understand it. As a former prosecutor, the thought of him going on the record for 3, 4, 5 hours and answering every question to try to keep his alleged mens rea out of this would be wonderful. So I look forward to figuring out why they did that. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Waters and Ranking Member McHenry, for hosting this important hearing. And thank you, Mr. John Ray, for joining us today. I want to start by zooming out a bit because FTX isn't an anomaly. It's a collapse. Is just the case of isn't just a case of one corrupt guy stealing money. It's about an entire industry that refuses to comply with existing regulation that thinks it's above the law. It is not. As we speak, Binance is being investigated by the Department of Justice. Tether is being investigated by DOJ as well. The SEC is investigating the co-founder of Terra Luna, which collapsed earlier this year, and Digital Currency Group has many of the same conflicts of interest present in the FTX case. The crypto industry is in crisis because crypto assets have no inherent value. These companies are making money using one thing: hype. And when the hype runs out, these businesses fail, and ordinary investors, especially latecomers who are disproportionately low-income, Black and Latino, lose. Mr. Ray, in your November 17th filing, you noted that your team had detected unauthorized minting of approximately 300 million in FTT tokens by an unauthorized source after the bankruptcy petition date. Your December 12th filing notes that while one source of this unauthorized minting remains under investigation, a second source has been confirmed without doubt. Who was the source of this unauthorized minting that your team has confirmed without a doubt?
The second source I think you're referring to is the Bahamian Commission.
And Mr. Ray, one of the unacceptable management practices at FTX that you identified was the absence of independent governance throughout the FTX group. People from the same group were leading various companies, and there were potential conflicts of interest because of this. Could you tell us more about the lack of independent governance, and what risks were created as a result?
We had no independent board of directors, and with the lack of oversight by an independent board, it leaves the company in the hands of a small group of individuals, and the company is effectively sort of naked when it comes to internal controls. So that was certainly the case here, and it's something that is atypical of companies of this size.
And customers report, and you've confirmed during the hearing, that FTX was asking customers to send money to Alameda instead of FTX. Mr. Bankman-Fried claims this is because in the early days of FTX, the company did not have a bank account. On a Twitter space yesterday, Mr. Bankman-Fried said he does not know if assets were moved over from the Alameda to FTX after those early days. To your knowledge, how long were customers instructed to send funds to Alameda that were meant for FTX?
We don't have a precise timeline of that circumstance. That's one of our investigations. We'll certainly look to what kind of communications were given to customers. Did they know? Did they actually have knowledge of that direction? Those are all questions.
And were the assets ever moved over to FTX, or were they allowed to stay with Alameda?
There were certainly certain assets were stayed with the exchange, effectively in a pot, if you will. But clearly, assets moved to Alameda, or those assets were there, continuously. So, clearly there was an allocation to Alameda of customer funds that were utilized for other purposes.
Thank you, sir. Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you so very much. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Auchincloss, who is also the vice chair of the full committee, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Ray, I appreciate your patience and diligence this afternoon in answering these long questions. You've addressed everything with care and thought. You haven't played any video games while you're talking to us, so it's terrific. Mr. Bankman-Fried leaked his written testimony to Forbes today. Just one more link in a long chain of dissembling and lies from Mr. Bankman-Fried. So I think it's important to allow you to respond to anything he put in there on the record here with us. He really makes two pointed assertions. One is that you haven't engaged with him and haven't allowed him access to his passwords and accounts. Can you explain to the committee now why that is the appropriate course of action?
Well, for a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, we wanted an independent, examination. We didn't want to rely on people who were potentially compromised. And as we now sit here today, we know that was a wise decision, right?
Yes.
Second of all, what he was asking for fundamentally was to allow access to a system that we know just hours after the bankruptcy filing, he had dissipated assets from the estate.
I think those two are sufficiently good reasons. I'll reclaim. The second broad point he makes is that were he allowed to restart FTX, he could raise the financing and make customers whole. That's, I think, a fair paraphrasing of what he's asserting. Again, can you respond to that and whether that's true and credible?
Yeah, in my history of doing corporate restructurings, I don't find that remotely believable, because the first thing an investor would have to do is pay several $1 billion just to have the company, back to the position it was in. So it's a fantastic idea.
It would be throwing good money after bad in the biggest sense of the word, right?
Correct.
Good, thank you. I just wanted to give you that opportunity. And I also want to associate myself with the very thoughtful line of questioning from both Ms. Ocasio-Cortez and Mr. Timmons, actually, from both sides of the aisle on the timeline here. And I'll just reiterate the timeline quickly. On November 6th, FTX Group was facing a liquidity crisis. On November 8th, FTX withdrawals were halted. On November 9th, Mr. Bankman-Fried sent an email to the Attorney General of the Bahamas saying the Bahamian customers could make withdrawals as they had, quote, segregated funds for all Bahamian customers, end quote, despite his awareness of FTX's withdrawal halt. And then on November 10th, 2 days after withdrawals were halted, nearly $100 million in cryptocurrency was withdrawn by those, quote, asserting to be Bahamian customers. And then, quite conveniently for Mr. Bankman-Fried's counsel, he is arrested right before he was due to provide hours worth of sworn testimony to Congress. Mr. Ray, do we have your commitment that as you continue to unravel this ball of yarn and pull on these relative threads here, that if you find any evidence of improper collusion between Mr. Bankman-Fried and any authorities in the Bahamas or elsewhere, that you will make that known to us?
Absolutely.
Thank you. And I want to close really with comments directly to the broader industry here. And I've long said that I'm neither a crypto bull nor a bear. My job as a policymaker is not to deliver new products or technology, but rather to advance laws and regulations that protect consumers, that preserve market integrity, and advance the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. And I maintain this market and tech agnostic position. I think it's the appropriate one. We need strong and clear regulations here from Washington. But I do want to say that my patience with the crypto bulls is wearing thin. It's been 14 years, and the American public has heard lots of promises, but it has seen lots of Ponzi schemes. For crypto, it's time to put up or shut up. It's worth noting that ARK, the innovation investor, several years ago identified 5 general-purpose technologies of the future: DNA sequencing, artificial intelligence, robotics, energy storage, and blockchain. And yet those first 4 disruptive technologies have already delivered game-changing innovation that affects my constituents in daily life. Blockchain has thus far delivered white papers and podcasts about Bitcoin and DAOs and NFTs, DeFi, and more. And it's all interesting, it's exciting even, but none of it has achieved product market fit at scale. And it's time for the blockchain investors and entrepreneurs to build things that matter or to lose more credibility. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Without objection, I would like to enter into the record the closing statements from Ranking Member McHenry and myself. And I'd like to thank you, Mr. John Ray III.
Chairwoman Waters.
Presence here today.
Chairwoman Waters, I've not had an opportunity to testify or to question the witness.
I'd like to thank you for your presence.
Chairwoman Waters,
And for the
parliamentary inquiry.
yes.
Are all members entitled to question witnesses?
You are, and if you would like to miss the votes on the floor for everybody.
Hey, it's
just
the
one
chairwoman's
moment.
prerogative to call
Just
a recess.
one moment, please.
That's your decision, not mine.
Just one moment, please. You may go right ahead and have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're certainly welcome, sir.
Mr. Ray, earlier today you said FTX was one of the worst bankruptcies you have handled in your 40 years of legal and restructuring experience. Under Mr. Bankman-Fried, FTX had almost no record keeping, risk management, or accounting. In fact, FTX had 0 accountants on their payroll. Mr. Bankman-Fried explained to Bloomberg Businessweek that FTX's accounting was done by him, and in his head, quote, "I was real lazy about the mental math. The complete lack of any basic record keeping makes it difficult to track down assets and untangle this mess. Are you aware of any additional wallets the co-founders potentially have access to that contain debtor assets?"
No, we're not.
There's also been very little attention to the banks that FTX had a relationship with. I don't know that I've heard about any questions today, but the ties between FTX and Farmington State Bank began in March when Alameda Research invested $11.5 million in the bank's parent company, FBH. Do you have any insight or additional information as to why a small agricultural lending bank with really no footprint in fintech or crypto has a relationship with FTX?
No, that's the subject of our inquiry. I mean, we do know, obviously, we made that investment.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. You've also stated that Alameda's business model as a market maker required deploying funds to various third-party exchanges, which were inherently unsafe and further exacerbated by the limited protections offered in certain foreign jurisdictions. To your knowledge, are any of the FTX co-founder or their family members affiliated with third-party exchanges that received funds from Alameda?
We're certainly investigating that. It's going to take some time to dig through that, but that's clearly a part of our focus.
Thank you. I appreciate you coming here today, and I'd like to yield the balance of my time to the ranking member, Mr. McHenry.
I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. As I was saying before, without objection, I would like to enter into the record the closing statements from Ranking Member McHenry and myself. I would like to thank you so very much, Mr. John Ray, for the time that you have spent here today in the way that you had helped us. And with that, I would recognize the Ranking Member for a minute.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And first, I want to say thank you to you, Madam Chair, and your team. Over the last 4 years as ranking member and chair of this committee, there are times we've worked together. There are times we haven't. There are times where we've agreed in public and disagreed in private, and then other times we've done the opposite. But I want to thank you for how we have attempted with one another to treat digital assets and the bipartisan work we have here. Mr. Ray, thank you for you and your team, your willingness to participate today, and the forthright nature by which you've handled a hearing like this. We know there will be ongoing conversations in the new year. The title of this hearing was Part 1. Part 2 will be next year. And as chair of the committee, it's my intention to continue the work of Chairwoman Waters when it comes to this matter. We know more because of your testimony. You had somebody who's a crypto genius, but behind closed doors was using QuickBooks. We know somebody who was a pretender to the technology, but was doing everything possible to obscure something that is innately a transparent product. Now we understand why. a lot more of the why. We wish you well in resolving these matters and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you're able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. The hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.